But one farmer says, seems to me there was a tea party in Boston that was illegal too.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
We shall seek to establish and maintain a dollar which will not change its purchasing and debt-paying power during the succeeding generation.
As anguished shrieks rose up from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Government credit and government currency are really one and the same thing. A reserve of gold and a small reserve of silver.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Well, some people still think it's money.
All right, so I fell into another rabbit hole, researching the views that some of the communist founders had towards precious metals and gold, specifically Karl Marx. It all started with an email from my dad discussing Karl Marx's views towards sound money, and the modern left, some of the apologists for Keynesianism and modern monetary theory that exists today, their way of misinterpreting it and trying to twist it to make it sound like he didn't really like precious metals. He didn't really mean what he said, or he was mistaken and wrong in perhaps his view of gold as a unit of exchange in an economy. So I fell into that rabbit hole and started reading, well, what did he think? Because I never really cared too much on the views of the communists. I steered quite away from, trying to subscribe to any of their ideology. And it was oftentimes too infuriating to really look at collectivism and that viewpoint. And that was probably wrong of me. I should have done so to do it at least. I guess when you look at any topic of conversation, you have to look at the opposing view sometimes, right? And you have to kind of wade into that, get a little dirty, and read perhaps what your enemy thinks. It's good to know their mindset. And yes, I do believe that communists and communism is an enemy to people like ourselves, those who work, save, and believe in property rights and independence and the individual as opposed to the state. So I went through and I found a lot of different writings. I mean, there's entire scholarly papers written on the subject. It's impossible to do all of it here. It would be a 27-hour video. There's no way we can do it. I pulled certain pieces, certain articles, and writings from Marx, and we're just going to go through some of it. It's going to be, yes, the way this channel does things, extemporaneous ramblings and me interjecting my opinion here and there, reading through snapshots of certain pieces and writings. I can't get them all in here. I'm telling you, there is a lot of it. So I'll do my best as far as sitting down here and talking into the blue snowball microphone here. And hopefully you guys can enjoy it. So let's take a look at what is Karl Marx and the communists, what did they think of gold, of precious metals? I started here by Louis Rouanet. This is from Ludwig von Mises Institute, the Austrian School of Economics, and this article is from July 9th, 2015, Lenin and Marx, Sound Money Advocates. Now, after we go through this, we'll get into more of the actual writings, specifically from Marx himself. But let's just read through this one together and see what you guys think, and you can add your comments and thoughts down below. Most modern socialists are in favor of inflation because it is supposed, in Keynes's words, to, quote, euthanize the rentiers. It doesn't mean, however, that the founding fathers of socialism were in favor of inflation. In fact, the opposite is true. Karl Marx had a wide knowledge of the economic literature, and even though he's usually wrong, he was correct in his preference for a gold standard. As for Lenin, he was, in his writings, opposed to inflation and saw paper money as a means used by the bourgeois capitalists to enrich themselves. Even though Marx and Lenin were not supporters of inflation, they supported sound money for the wrong reasons. But at least we can say that concerning money, they did not succumb to naive inflationist views. Just that opening alone is kind of like an artillery shell in my head. I mean, when you compare, we're going to take this as, let's pretend it's true for a moment, and I do tend to believe it. think of what we have to deal with today. The people that are making decisions today in the United States and the U.S. economy, the modern monetary theory, those like AOC and Bernie Sanders, even the Republican side. I mean, you've got Trump talking about negative interest rates. You've got the Fed and the Treasury in this bizarre relationship, perpetual debt, rampant printing of money and increasing of the money supply, where it's completely unbacked. It's not tied to any commodity whatsoever. It just is pure, unadulterated fiat, trash, coupons, garbage, monopoly money. Very impressive that we have taken it to that level in just 40 years since the expiration, since the elimination and destruction of that bizarre Bretton Woods agreement, which still had the dollar somewhat pegged to gold, even though you could not exchange it yourself. Karl Marx, Inflation and the Gold Standard. Marx applied the labor value theory to money. According to Marx, the use of a particular commodity, like gold or silver, for money rests on the fact that, like all other commodities, there is an amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. If, for example, 1 ounce of gold requires 10 hours labor, its value is equal to another product requiring 10 hours labor. Marx's labor theory led him to say that although gold and silver are not by nature money, money is by nature gold and silver. Brilliant point. How often have we said here on this channel that gold and silver are truly a store of labor? It's where you lock up your energy, your work, to unleash it and release it later on down the road, and it preserves and maintains that store of labor over time. I would have never guessed that me and Marx had this agreement. It's interesting. I actually share in common with Marx this belief. What Marx put forward was that the total value of needed currency represented a total amount of labor value, and therefore a total weight of gold. According to Marx, if the total of gold is replaced by inconvertible paper money, and the paper money is then issued in excess, prices will go up. Well, that's, again, something I agree with Marx on. If the paper money is in excess, if there is more of it than represents the amount of gold coins of like denomination, which could actually be current, it will, apart from the danger of falling into general disrepute, represent only that quantity of gold which, in accordance with the laws of circulation of commodities, is really required and is alone capable of being represented by paper. If the quantity of paper money issued is, for instance, double what it ought to be, then, in actual fact, 1 pound has become the money name of about 1/8 of an ounce of gold, instead of about 1/4 of an ounce. The effect is the same as if an alteration had taken place in the function of gold as a standard of prices. The values previously expressed by the price 1 pound will now be expressed by the price 2 pounds. And a little background, I'm making this video currently when this morning news broke. The Democrats in the House are requesting an additional $3 trillion US to inject into the economy, bailout, stimulus, giving people $25,000 here, $1,200 there, $6,000 there, just tons of money coming out of nowhere. So this is a very pertinent article with the backdrop of the economy in which we currently reside. You know, this present time period we live in. This is very applicable. I mean, even Marx himself talked about the rising of prices with the increase of the money supply. He knew it was real, and you really can't argue with it. Therefore, Marx opposed the use of inflation as a means for increasing production. However, Marx's monetary theory is very confusing. Concerning money, Karl Marx owes nothing to Ricardo. He was influenced by Tuch and the banking school, while he was very critical of the currency school. Furthermore, Marx was fiercely opposed to Peel's Act of 1844, which forbade notes unbacked by metallic money. Oddly enough, however, Marx was criticizing fiduciary credit as being fictitious capital, which seems to be in contradiction with his opposition to Peel's Act. We must keep in mind, however, that the main difference between Marx and other economists is that Marx was simply trying to describe how capitalism operates with or without inflation. He was not saying that inflation will improve or destroy capitalism. In Marx's view, capitalism is inevitably unstable and doomed. For him, workers must abolish capitalism and replace it with socialism, in which there are no problems of prices, inflation, crisis, and unemployment. We will continue on with this article, but let's take a look at the Peel's Act. Again, this is the rabbit hole. This is what you fall into when you start reading things like this. So join me here. It was called the Bank Charter Act of 1844. The Bank Charter Act of 1844, sometimes referred to as the Peel Banking Act of 1844, was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed under the government of Robert Peel, which restricted the powers of British banks and gave exclusive note-issuing powers to the Central Bank of England. It is one of the Bank of England Acts 1694 to 1892. The purpose: until the mid-19th century, commercial banks in Britain and Ireland were able to issue their own banknotes, and notes issued by provincial banking companies were commonly in circulation. Under the 1844 Act, bullionism was institutionalized in Britain, creating a ratio between the gold reserves held by the Bank of England and the notes that the bank could issue, and limited the issuance of non-gold-backed Bank of England notes to up to £14 million. The Act also placed strict curbs on the issuance of notes by the country banks, barring any new banks of issue in England and Wales, and thus beginning the process of centralizing banknote issuance. Okay, so centralizing, consolidating power with the Bank of England, making them the only ones to be allowed to issue such notes. The Act was a victory for the British Currency School, who argued that the issue of new banknotes was a major cause of price inflation. Although the Act required new notes to be backed fully by gold or government debt, the government retained the power to suspend the Act in case of financial crisis, and this in fact happened several times in 1847 and 1857 and during the 1866 Overend Gurney crisis. Also, while the Act restricted the supply of new notes, it did not restrict the creation of new bank deposits, and these would continue to increase in size over the course of the 19th century. Bank deposits are sums of money that a bank backed by considerable collateral may choose to deposit in the holder's account as a loan, which requires repayment with interest. The money comes into existence when the bank creates the deposit, and when the loan is paid off, the money disappears from the bank's balance sheet. While a loan is effectively a cash advance provided by the bank to the customer in the long term, the effect of unrestricted creation of bank deposits, money, can lead to inflation in the markets into which that money is channeled, such as the property market through banks' mortgage lending. My goodness, my friends, does that ring a bell? Think of the loans, the injections from the Fed. They're giving money into the system, loaning it, and then that does, in fact, lead to and in turn create inflation. Prices will go up in whatever marketplace that money finds itself. People knew this 200 plus years ago. Karl Marx knew this. Those that were banking in England knew this. And just for those of you who are United Kingdom friends of the channel, I know there's many of you, Enlightened Patriot being one of the most dear UK members of the channel here. And D-Dub, I think you are also in the UK. A few of you have sent me a little old, pound coins from the 80s. And I know we're taking a side street here, but just bear with me for a moment. Think of the strength of the pound. If you have a gold sovereign, £1, hold that in your hand for a moment, and then hold a £1 coin from the 80s or 90s or today. Think of the deterioration in the value of your currency just based on the issuance of banknotes over time. Think of that. £1 used to be 0.2354 ounces of gold. And now it's nothing. It's worth nothing. Unbelievable. As a result of the act, as provincial banking companies merged to form larger banks, they lost their right to issue notes. The English private banknote eventually disappeared, leaving the Bank of England with a monopoly of note issue in England and Wales. The last private bank to issue its own banknotes in England and Wales was Fox, Fowler and Company in 1921. The Banknotes Scotland Act of 1845, adopted a year later, was more lenient. As in England, there could be no new banks of issue, but merging banks could combine their issues. Furthermore, banks in Scotland could issue more than their 1845 circulation amount as long as the additional circulation was backed, pound for pound, with gold reserves at head office. A generation later, and much to the envy of English competitors, the Scottish banks even took advantage of their exclusion from the 1833 ruling on London offices to open up in the capital without having to sacrifice their banknote issues. Today, 3 commercial banks in Scotland and 4 in Northern Ireland continue to issue their own sterling banknotes, regulated by the Bank of England. The Banking Act of 2009 abolished the weekly return of the number of banknotes issued by the Bank of England. Section 6 of the Bank Charter Act of 1844, bank to produce weekly account shall cease to have effect. So there's the Appeal Act. Let's continue on with our commie friends here. Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and inflation. The following quote is often attributed to Lenin. The best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. Interesting. The best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. This supposed statement has circulated widely among economists and the public. Hellwig remarked that it is almost a ritual on the occasion of the required tributes to a stable monetary standard to quote Lenin as a boogeyman. The problem is that this quote has never been found in Lenin's works. The first attribution of this statement was made by J.M. Keynes in his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919, with John Maynard Keynes. No one at the time challenged what Keynes was attributing to Lenin, and even today this quote is still used by some sound money advocates. However, Lenin's few remarks on monetary matters give the opposite impression from the remark attributed to him by Keynes. In September 1917, before the Bolsheviks overthrew the government in power, Lenin wrote an article on the threatening catastrophe, where he speaks about money and banking. Of inflation, he said, now this is Lenin, everybody recognizes that the issue of paper money is the worst kind of a compulsory loan, that it worsens the conditions principally of the workers, of the poorest sections of the population, that it is the chief evil in the financial confusion. The unlimited issue of paper money encourages speculation, allows the capitalists to make millions, and places tremendous obstacles in the path of the much-needed expansion of production, for the dearth of materials, machines, etc., grows and progresses by leaps and bounds. How can matters be improved when the riches acquired by the rich are being concealed? This paragraph could have been written by an Austrian economist, and it is known that the Marxist tradition is sometimes close to the Austrian analysis concerning business cycles. See Huerta de Soto's Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles. Like Lenin, we believe that inflation can foster income inequality, hamper economic growth, impoverish the poor, and cause asset inflation. However, once they were in power, the Bolsheviks were responsible for hyperinflation. In Socialism, Ludwig von Mises wrote, "The Bolshevists, with their inimitable gift for rationalizing their resentments and interpreting defeats as victories, have represented their financial policy as an effort to abolish capitalism by destroying the institution of money." It truly is amazing, because those drunk with power, and once people find themselves in the halls of government, seem to pretend as if they are immune to the laws of economics, and they believe in their delusional mindset that, oh, that can't happen here, that can't happen to us. And it holds true here, now, today, in America. Those in power do not believe these same consequences of inflation or hyperinflation will ever affect this economy. They don't look at Argentina or Venezuela or Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe or any of the other 300 to 500 expired and extinct currencies. I think the number is even 3,000 if you go back far enough. They just don't believe that it can happen here. They are stricken with the normalcy bias and even worse, just pure absolute delusion. Mises is right, but he forgot to say that political opportunism and not ideology was the reason why communists use inflation. Basically, for the communists, inflation is wrong when communists are not running things, but it is all right when they are in control. Professor E.H. Carr wrote, "None of the Bolsheviks wanted or planned inflation, but when that happened, since the printing press was their main source of revenue, they rationalized it ex post facto by describing it as a death to the capitalists and a foretaste of the moneyless communist society." Talk of this kind was widely current in Moscow in 1919 and 1920. Keynes, in 1919, had no special knowledge of Lenin. Everything that came out of Moscow was automatically attributed to Lenin or Trotsky, or both. Hayek wrote once that as long as it remains theoretical, socialism is internationalist, but when it is put into practice, it becomes violently nationalist. We should also say, as long as it remains theoretical, Marxism is anti-inflationist, but when it is put into practice, it becomes violently inflationist. And many of the people today that you could consider Marxists pretend that they are for the people, for the small person, the peasant class, the underserved. And they don't realize that any of their ideas, any of their projects, the things that they wish to do, such as modern monetary theory, will directly negatively impact the lower classes. And they just don't see it. They don't see the consequences of the decisions they wish to implement upon a society. Now, this is Karl Marx' Critique of Political Economy, 1859. This is on the precious metals. At first, the process of bourgeois production takes possession of metallic currency as an existing and ready-made instrument, which, although it has been gradually reorganized in its basic structure, has nevertheless been retained. The question why gold and silver and not other commodities are used as the material of money lies outside the confines of the bourgeois system. We shall therefore do no more than summarize the most important aspects. Because universal labor time itself can only display quantitative differences, the object to be reorganized as its specific embodiment must be able to express purely quantitative differences, thus presupposing identical homogeneous quality. This is the first condition that has to be fulfilled if a commodity is to function as a measure of value. If, for instance, one evaluates all commodities in terms of oxen, hides, corn, etc., one has in fact to measure them in ideal average oxen, average hides, etc. Since there are quantitative differences between one ox and another, one lot of corn and another, one hide and another, gold and silver, on the other hand, as simple substances, are always uniform, and consequently equal quantities of them have equal values. Another condition that has to be fulfilled by the commodity, which is to serve as universal equivalent, and that follows directly from its function of representing purely quantitative differences, is its divisibility into any desired number of parts and the possibility of combining these again so that money of account can be represented in palpable form too. Gold and silver possess these qualities to an exceptional degree. As means of circulation, gold and silver have an advantage over other commodities in that their high specific gravity, representing considerable weight and a relatively small space, is matched by their economic specific gravity in containing much labor time, i.e. considerable exchange value in a relatively small volume. This facilitates transfer from one hand to another, from one country to another, enabling gold and silver suddenly to appear and just as suddenly to disappear. In short, these qualities impart physical mobility, the sine qua non of the commodity that is to serve as the perpetuum mobile of the process of circulation. The high specific value of precious metals, their durability, relative indestructibility, the fact that they do not oxidize when exposed to the air, and that gold in particular is insoluble in acids other than aqua regia, all these physical properties make precious metals the natural material for hoarding. Peter Martyr, who was apparently a great lover of chocolate, remarks, therefore, of the sacks of cocoa, which in Mexico served as a sort of money. Blessed money, which furnishes mankind with a sweet and nutritious beverage, and protects its innocent possessors from the infernal disease of avarice, since it cannot be long hoarded nor hidden underground. De Orbe Novo, Alcala, 1530, December 5th. Metals in general owe their great importance in the direct process of production to their use as instruments of production. Gold and silver, quite apart from their scarcity, cannot be utilized in this way because compared with iron, and even with copper, in the hardened state in which the ancients used it, they are very soft and therefore to a large extent lack the quality on which the value of metals in general depends. Of course, this is before the electronic era in which gold and silver found incredible uses and applications in the industrial and computer worlds. Just as the precious metals are useless in the direct process of production, that's not the case anymore, which actually drives the case for gold and silver even further now, so they appear to be unnecessary as means of subsistence, i.e., as articles of consumption. Again, not true. Silver is much rapidly consumed in the industrial applications. Any quantity of them can thus be placed at will within the social process of circulation without impairing production and consumption as such. Their individual use value does not conflict with their economic function. Gold and silver, on the other hand, are not only negatively superfluous, i.e. dispensable objects, but their aesthetic qualities make them the natural material for pomp, ornament, glamour, the requirements of festive occasions, in short, the positive expression of superabundance and wealth. They appear, so to speak, as solidified light rays from a subterranean world, since all the rays of light in their original composition are reflected by silver, while red alone, the color of the highest potency, is reflected by gold. Sense of color, moreover, is the most popular form of aesthetic perception in general. The etymological connection between the names of precious metals and references to color in various Indo-European languages has been demonstrated by Jacob Grimm, see his History of the German Language. Finally, the fact that it is possible to transform gold and silver from coin into bullion, from bullion into articles of luxury, and vice versa, the advantage they have over other commodities of not being confined to the particular useful form they have once been given, makes them the natural material for money, which must constantly change from one form to another. Nature no more produces money than it does bankers or a rate of exchange. But since in bourgeois production wealth as a fetish must be crystallized in a particular substance, gold and silver are its appropriate embodiment. Gold and silver are not by nature money, but money consists by its nature of gold and silver. Gold or silver, as crystallization of money, is on one hand not only the product of the circulation process, but actually its sole stable product. Gold and silver are, on the other hand, finished primary products, and they directly represent both these aspects, which are not distinguished by specific forms. The universal product of the social process, or the social process itself considered as a product, is a particular natural product, a metal, which is contained in the earth's crust and can be dug up. We have seen that gold and silver cannot comply with the demand that as money they should have an invariable value. Their value is nevertheless more stable than that of other commodities on the average, as even Aristotle noted. Apart from the general effect of an appreciation or depreciation of the precious metals Variations in the relative value of gold and silver are of particular importance since both are used side by side as monetary material on the world market. The purely economic reasons of such changes in value, conquests, and other political upheavals which exerted a substantial influence on the value of metals in antiquity have merely a local and temporary effect, must be attributed to changes in the labor time required for the production of these metals. This labor time itself will depend on the relative scarcity of natural deposits and the difficulties involved in procuring them in a purely metallic state. Gold is in fact the first metal that man discovered. On the one hand, it occurs in nature in pure crystalline form, as a separate substance not chemically combined with other substances, or in a virgin state, as the alchemists said. On the other hand, nature herself performs the technical work by washing gold on a large scale in rivers. Only the crudest labor is required on the part of man for extracting gold either from rivers or from alluvial deposits, whereas production of silver requires mining and in general a relatively high level of technical development. The value of silver is therefore originally higher than that of gold, although it is absolutely less scarce. Strabo's statement that an Arabian tribe gave 10 pounds of gold for 1 pound of iron and 2 pounds of gold for 1 pound of silver is by no means incredible. But the value of silver tends to fall in relation to that of gold as the productive powers of social labor develop, and consequently the product of simple labor becomes more expensive compared with that of complex labor. And with the Earth's crust being increasingly opened up, the original surface sources of gold are liable to be exhausted. Finally, at a given stage of development, of technology, and of the means of communication, the discovery of new territories containing gold or silver plays an important role. The ratio of gold to silver in ancient Asia was 6-1 or 8-1. The latter ratio was prevalent in China and Japan, even in the early 19th century, 10-1. The ratio obtaining in the Xenophon's time can be regarded as the average ratio of the middle period of antiquity. The working of the Spanish silver mines by Carthage and later by Rome exerted a rather similar influence on the ancient world to that of the discovery of the American mines on modern Europe. During the era of the Roman emperors, 15 or 16-1 can be taken as the rough average, although the value of silver in Rome often sank even lower. During the following period, reaching from the Middle Ages to modern times, a similar movement, which begins with a relative depreciation of gold and ends with a fall in the value of silver, takes place. The average ratio in the Middle Ages, as in Xenophon's time, was 10-1, and as a result of the discovery of mines in America, the ratio once again becomes 16 or 15-1. The discovery of gold in Australia, California, and Colombia will probably lead to another fall in the value of gold. Very incredible piece of history here, and in this reading was when it comes to the relationship over time of silver and gold. And I know some of you silver guys are loving it. Karl Marx, Critique of Political Economy, Part 2, Money or Simple Circulation. Gladstone, speaking in a parliamentary debate on Sir Robert Peel's Bank Act of 1844 and 1845, observed that even love has not turned more men into fools than has meditation upon the nature of money. He spoke of Britons to Britons. The Dutch, on the other hand, who in spite of Petty's doubts possessed a divine sense for money speculation from time immemorial, have never lost their senses in speculation about money. The principal difficulty in the analysis of money is surmounted as soon as it is understood that the commodity is the origin of money. After that, it is only a question of clearly comprehending the specific form peculiar to it. This is not so easy because all bourgeois relations appear to be gilded, i.e., they appear to be money relations, and the money form, therefore, seems to possess an infinitely varied content, which is quite alien to this form. During the following analysis, it is important to keep in mind that we are only concerned with those forms of money which arise directly from the exchange of commodities, but not with forms of money such as credit money, which belong to a higher stage of production. For the sake of simplicity, gold is assumed throughout to be the money commodity. Measure of value. The first phase of circulation is, as it were, a theoretical phase preparatory to real circulation. Commodities which exist as use values must first of all assume a form in which they appear to one another nominally as exchange values, as definite quantities of materialized universal labor time. I know it's confusing, but remember what we talked about earlier as being a store of value, a store of labor. The first necessary move in this process is, as we have seen, that the commodities set apart a specific commodity, say gold, which becomes the direct reification of universal labor time or the universal equivalent. Let us return for a moment to the form in which gold is converted into money by commodities. 1 ton of iron equals 2 ounces of gold. 1 quarter of wheat equals 1 ounce of gold. 100 weight of mocha coffee, a quarter ounce of gold. 100 weight of potash, a half ounce of gold. 1 ton of Brazil timber, 1.5 ounces of gold. Y commodities equals X ounces of gold. In this series of equations, iron, wheat, coffee, potash, etc., appear to one another as materialization of uniform labor, that is, labor materialized in gold, in which all distinctive features of the concrete labor represented in the different use values are entirely obliterated. They are as values identical, i.e., materializations of the same labor, or the same materialization of labor, gold. Since they are uniform materializations of the same labor, they differ only in one way, quantitatively. In other words, they represent different magnitudes of value because their use values contain unequal amounts of labor time. These individual commodities can be compared with one another as embodiments of universal labor time, since they have been compared with universal labor time in the shape of the excluded commodity, gold. The same dynamic relation, as a result of which commodities become exchange values for one another, causes the labor time contained in gold to represent universal labor time, a given amount of which is expressed in different quantities of iron, wheat, coffee, etc. In short, in the use values of all commodities, or it may be displayed directly in the infinite series of commodity equivalents. Since the exchange value of all commodities is expressed in gold, the exchange value of gold is directly expressed in all commodities. Because the commodities themselves assume the form of exchange value for one another, they turn gold into the universal equivalent, or into money. Gold becomes the measure of value because the exchange value of all commodities is measured in gold, is expressed in the relation of a definite quantity of gold and a definite quantity of commodity containing equal amounts of labor time. To begin with, gold becomes the universal equivalent, or money, only because it thus functions as the measure of value, and as such its own value is measured directly in all commodity equivalents. The exchange value of all commodities, on the other hand, is now expressed in gold. One has to distinguish a qualitative and a quantitative aspect in this expression. The exchange value of the commodity exists as the embodiment of equal uniform labor time. The value of the commodity is thus fully expressed, for to the extent that commodities are equated with gold, they are equated with one another. Their golden equivalent reflects the universal character of the labor time contained in them, on the one hand, and its quantity on the other hand. The exchange value of commodities thus expressed in the form of universal equivalence, and simultaneously as the degree of this equivalence in terms of a specific commodity, that is, a single equation in which commodities are compared with a specific commodity, constitutes price. Price is the converted form in which the exchange value of commodities appears within the circulation process. I know it sounds very complicated, but I mean, it really is simple. Gold is the ultimate thing all other commodities are based on and valued on. All money, everything. It's that inverted pyramid we've talked about. Everything is based on how many grams or grains or ounces of gold it is worth. And he's explaining that in very, complex way, obviously. Thus, as a result of the same process through which the values of commodities are expressed in gold prices, gold is transformed into the measure of value and thence into money. If the values of all commodities were measured in silver or wheat or copper and accordingly expressed in terms of silver, wheat, or copper prices, then silver, wheat, or copper would become the measure of value and consequently universal equivalence. Commodities as exchange values must be antecedent to circulation in order to appear as prices in circulation. Gold becomes the measure of value only because the exchange value of all commodities is estimated in terms of gold. The universality of this dynamic relation, from which alone springs the capacity of gold to act as a measure, presupposes, however, that every single commodity is measured in terms of gold in accordance with the labor time contained in both, so that the real measure of commodity and gold is labor itself. That is, commodity and gold are, as exchange values, equated by direct exchange. How this equating is carried through in practice cannot be discussed in the context of simple circulation. It is evident, however, that in countries where gold and silver are produced, a definite amount of labor time is directly incorporated in a definite quantity of gold and silver, whereas countries which produce no gold and silver arrive at the same result in a roundabout way by direct or indirect exchange of their home products, i.e. of a definite portion of their average national labor, for a definite quantity of labor time embodied in the gold and silver of countries that possess mines. Gold must be in principle a variable value if it is to serve as a measure of value, because only as reification of labor time can it become the equivalent of other commodities. But as a result of changes in the productivity of concrete labor, the same amount of labor time is embodied in unequal volumes of the same type. Of use values. The valuation of all commodities in terms of gold, like the expression of the exchange value of any commodity in terms of the use value of another commodity, merely presupposes that at a given moment gold represents a definite quantity of labor time. The law of exchange value set forth earlier applies to changes occurring in the value of gold. If the exchange value of commodities remains unchanged, then a general rise of their prices in terms of gold can only take place when the exchange value of gold falls. If the exchange value of gold remains unchanged, then a general rise of prices in terms of gold is only possible if the exchange values of all commodities rise. The reverse takes place in the case of a general decline in the price of commodities. If the value of an ounce of gold falls or rises in consequence of a change in the labor time required for its production, then it will fall or rise equally in relation to all other commodities, and will thus, for all of them, continue to represent a definite volume of labor time. The same exchange values will now be estimated in quantities of gold which are larger or smaller than before, but they will be estimated in accordance with their values and will therefore maintain the same value relative to one another. The ratio 2:4 to 8 remains the same whether it becomes 1:2 to 4 or 4:8 to 16. The fact that because of the changing value of gold, exchange values are represented by varying quantities of gold does not prevent gold from functioning as the measure of value, any more than the fact that the value of silver is 1/15 of that of gold prevents silver from taking over this function. Labor time is the measure of both gold and commodities, and gold becomes the measure of value only because all commodities are measured in terms of gold. It is consequently merely an illusion created by the circulation process to suppose that money makes commodities commensurable. On the contrary, it is only the commensurability of commodities as materialized labor time which converts gold into money. The concrete form in which commodities enter the process of exchange is as use values. The commodities will only become universal equivalents as a result of their alienation. The establishment of their price is merely their nominal conversion into the universal equivalent, an equation with gold which still has to be put into practice. But because prices convert commodities only nominally into gold, or only into imaginary gold, i.e. the existence of commodities as money is indeed not yet separated from their real existence, gold has been merely transformed into imaginary money, only into the measure of value, and definite quantities of gold serve, in fact, simply as names for definite quantities of labor time. The distinct form in which gold crystallizes into money depends in each case on the way in which the exchange values of commodities are represented with regard to one another. Commodities now confront one another in a dual form, really as use values, and nominally as exchange values. They represent now for one another the dual form of labor contained in them, since the particular concrete labor actually exists as their use value, while universal abstract labor time assumes an imaginary existence in their price, in which they are all alike embodiments of the same substance of value, differing only quantitatively. The difference between exchange value and price is, on the one hand, merely nominal. As Adam Smith says, labor is the real price of commodities, and money their nominal price. Instead of saying that 1 quarter of wheat is worth 30 days' labor, one now says it is worth 1 ounce of gold, when 1 ounce of gold is produced in 30 working days. The difference is, on the other hand, so far from being simply a nominal difference, that all the storms which threaten the commodity in the actual process of circulation center upon it. A quarter of wheat contains 30 days' labor, and it therefore does not have to be expressed in terms of labor time. But gold is a commodity distinct from wheat, and only circulation can show whether the quarter of wheat is actually turned into an ounce of gold, as has been anticipated in its price. This depends on whether or not the wheat proves to be a use value, whether or not the quantity of labor time contained in it proves to be the quantity of labor time necessarily required by society for the production of a quarter of wheat. The commodity as such is an exchange value. The commodity has a price. This difference between exchange value and price is a reflection of the fact that the particular individual labor contained in the commodity can only, through alienation, be represented as its opposite, impersonal, abstract, general, and only in this form, social, labor, i.e. money. Whether it can be thus represented or not seems a matter of chance. Although, therefore, the price gives exchange value a form of existence which is only nominally distinct from the commodity, and the two aspects of the labor contained in the commodity appear as yet only as different modes of expression, while on the other hand, gold, the embodiment of universal labor time, accordingly confronts concrete commodities merely as an imaginary measure of value, yet the existence of price as an expression of exchange value, or of gold as a measure of value, entails the necessity for alienation of commodities in exchange for glittering gold, and thus the possibility of their non-alienation. In short, there is here contained in latent form the whole contradiction which arises because the product is a commodity, or because the particular labor of an isolated individual can become socially effective only if it is expressed as its direct opposite, i.e. abstract universal labor. The Utopians, who wish to retain commodities but not money, production based on private exchange, without the essential conditions for this type of production, are therefore quite consistent when they seek to, quote, abolish money, not only in its palpable state, but even in the nebulous chimerical state that it assumes as the measure of value. For beneath the invisible measure of value lurks hard money. Given the process by which gold has been turned into the measure of value and exchange value into price, all commodities, when expressed in their prices, are merely imagined quantities of gold on various magnitudes. Since they are thus various quantities of the same thing, namely gold, they are similar, comparable, and commensurable, and thus arises the technical necessity of relating them to a definite quantity of gold as a unit of measure. This unit of measure then develops into a scale of measure by being divided into aliquot parts, which are in turn subdivided into aliquot parts. The quantities of gold themselves, however, are measured by weight. The standard weights generally used for metals accordingly provide ready-made standard measures, which originally also served as standard measures of price wherever metallic currency was in use. Since commodities are no longer compared as exchange values, which are measured in terms of labor time, but as magnitudes of the same denomination measured in terms of gold, the measure of value, becomes the standard of price. The comparison of commodity prices in terms of different quantities of gold thus becomes crystallized in figures denoting imaginary quantities of gold and representing gold as a standard measure divided into aliquot parts. Gold, as measures of value and as standard of price, has quite distinct specific functions, and the confusion of the one with the other has led to the most absurd theories. Gold as materialized labor time is a measure of value. As a piece of metal of definite weight, it is the standard of price. Gold becomes the measure of value because, as an exchange value, it is compared with the exchange values of other commodities. In its aspect as a standard of price, a definite quantity of gold serves as a unit for other quantities of gold. Gold is the measure of value because its value is variable. It is the standard of price because it has been established as an invariable unit of weight. Here, as in all cases of measuring quantities of the same denomination, stability and exactitude of the proportions is essential. The necessity of establishing a quantity of gold as the unit of measure and its aliquot parts as subdivisions of this unit has given rise to the idea that a fixed ratio of values has been set up between a definite quantity of gold, whose value is of course variable, and the exchange values of commodities. But such a view simply ignores the fact that the exchange values of commodities are turned into prices, into quantities of gold, before gold becomes the standard of price. Quite irrespective of any changes in the value of gold, different quantities of gold will always represent the same ratio of values with regard to one another. If the value of gold should fall by 1,000%, then the value of 12 ounces of gold would still be 12 times bigger than that of 1 ounce of gold. And so far as prices are concerned, what matters is only the proportion of the different quantities of gold to one another. Since, on the other hand, a rise or fall in the value of an ounce of gold does not in any way affect its weight, the weight of its aliquot parts remains likewise unaffected. Gold can thus always serve as a stable standard of price regardless of any changes in its value. As a result of an historical process, which, as we shall explain later, was determined by the nature of metallic currency, the names of particular weights were retained for constantly changing and diminishing weights of precious metals functioning as the standard of price. Thus, the English pound sterling denotes less than 1/3 of its original weight. The pound Scots before the Union, only 1/36. The French livre, 1/74. The Spanish maravedí, less than 1/1000th. And the Portuguese real, an even smaller proportion. Historical development thus led to a separation of the money names of certain weights of metals from the common names of these weights, because the designation of the unit of measure, its aliquot parts, and their names is, on the one hand, purely conventional, and on the other hand must be accepted as universal and indispensable within the sphere of circulation. It had to be established by legal means. The purely formal enactment thus devolved upon the government. Which particular metal served as the material of money depended on the given social conditions. The standard of price is of course different in different countries. In England, for example, the ounce as a weight of metal is divided into pennyweights, grains, and carats troy. But the ounce of gold as the unit of money is divided into 3 7/8 sovereigns, the sovereign into 20 shillings, and the shilling into 12 pence, so that 100 pounds of 22-carat gold, 1,200 ounces, equals 4,672 sovereigns and 10 shillings. But in the world market, where state frontiers disappear, such national features of the standards of money disappear as well, and are replaced by measures of weight generally used for metals. The price of a commodity, or the quantity of gold into which it is nominally converted, is now expressed, therefore, in the monetary names of the standard of gold. Thus, instead of saying a quarter of wheat is worth an ounce of gold, one would say, in England, it is worth 3 pounds, 17 shillings, and 10 pence, I believe that is. All prices are thus expressed in the same denomination. The specific form which the exchange value of commodities assumes is converted into denominations of money, by which their value is expressed. Money, in turn, becomes money of account. The transformation of commodities into money of account in the mind, on paper, or in words takes place whenever the aspect of exchange value becomes fixed in a particular type of wealth. This transformation needs the material of gold, but only in imagination. Not a single atom of real gold is used to estimate the value of 1,000 bales of cotton in terms of a certain number of ounces of gold, and then to express this number of ounces in pounds, the names of account of the ounce. For instance, not a single ounce of gold was in circulation in Scotland before Sir Robert Peel's Bank Act of 1845, although the ounce of gold, called 3 pounds 17 shillings 10 pence, as the British standard of account, served as the legal standard of price. Similarly, silver serves as the standard of price in exchange of commodities between Siberia and China, although this trade is in fact merely barter. It makes no difference, therefore, to gold as money of account whether or not its standard unit or its subdivisions are actually coined. During the reign of William the Conqueror, 1 pound sterling, at that time a pound of pure silver, and the shilling, 1/20th of a pound, existed in England only as money of account, while the penny, 1/240th of a pound of silver, was the largest silver coin in existence. On the other hand, there are no shillings or pence in England today, although they are legal names of account for definite fractions of an ounce of gold. Money as money of account may exist only nominally, while actually existing money may be coined according to an entirely different standard. Thus, in many of the English colonies in North America, the money in circulation consisted of Spanish and Portuguese coins till late in the 18th century, whereas the money of account was everywhere the same as in England. Because as standard of price, gold is expressed by the same names of account as the prices of commodities, for example, 3 pounds 17 shillings and 10.5 pence, may denote an ounce of gold just as well as a ton of iron, these names of account are called the mint price of gold. Thus the queer notion arose that gold is estimated in its own material, and that, unlike all other commodities, its price is fixed by the state. The establishing of names of account for definite weights of gold was mistaken for the establishing of the value of these weights. Gold has neither a fixed price nor any price at all, when it is a factor in the determination of prices, and therefore functions as money of account. In order to have a price, in other words, to be expressed in terms of a specific commodity functioning as the universal equivalent, this other commodity would have to play the same exclusive role in the process of circulation as gold. But two commodities, which exclude all other commodities, would exclude each other as well. Consequently, wherever silver and gold exist side by side as legal money, i.e. measures of value, the vain attempt has always been made to treat them as one and the same substance. If one assumes that a given labor time is invariably materialized in the same proportion in silver and gold, then one assumes in fact that silver and gold are the same substance, and that silver, the less valuable metal, represents a constant fraction of gold. The history of the monetary system in England from the reign of Edward III up to the time of George II consists of a continuous series of disturbances caused by conflict between the legally established ratio between the values of gold and silver and the actual fluctuations in their value. Sometimes the value of gold was too high, sometimes that of silver. The metal whose value was estimated at too low a rate was withdrawn from circulation, melted down, and exported. The value ratio of the two metals was then once again changed by law, but soon the new nominal value in its turn clashed with the actual value ratio. In our own time, the slight and short-lived fall in the value of gold as compared with silver, brought about by the Indian and Chinese demand for silver, produced the same phenomenon on a large scale in France, the export of silver and the elimination of silver from the sphere of circulation by gold. During the years 1855, 1856, and 1857, the excess of France's gold imports over her gold exports amounted to 41,580,000 pounds, while the excess of her silver exports over silver imports came to 34,704,000 pounds. In countries like France, where both metals are legally sanctioned measures of value and both are accepted as legal tender, where moreover every person can pay in the one or the other metal as he pleases, the metal whose value rises is in fact at a premium, and its price, like that of any other commodity, is measured in terms of the overrated metal, which thus serves alone as the measure of value. All historical experience in this sphere simply shows that, where two commodities function as legally valid measures of value, it is always one of them, only which actually maintains this position. Okay, we're going to conclude most of our reading here of Marx's views on metals. There's a lot to it. I mean, I'm talking volumes. I actually had to eliminate an entire manuscript from a professor who wrote on Marx's views of precious metals as money. And there's just a lot of material here. There's a lot to discuss. I mean, one thing, for example, just in this paragraph alone that we just read through, think of the competition between gold and the unbacked dollar as being circulating as money. Now, is the dollar, do we look at it as its value in gold or gold in the value of dollars? Again, like you said, gold doesn't have a value. Gold is the value. It is the standard. And the fiat that we see circulating, this is me speaking now, will always try to find its way into gold. It's the reason central banks vault and hold it still. Again, 19% of above ground gold held and hoarded by the central banks. We've seen the attributes here of gold. We've seen the discussion on inflation and unbacked fiat. I mean, this was an incredible piece of reading, in my opinion. I learned a lot going through these materials. I hope you guys did too, and I hope there's a lot more to discuss down in the comments. But the one thing is, only one commodity can circulate as the money, as the standard of price in which all labor is based upon. And truly, history has shown over time that that is truly gold. I know silver has served it as well. Industrialization and modern technology has made the extraction and refining of silver a lot more efficient and easier than in ancient times. But they conserve the ratio of the two. I don't like to get into the whole, is it 15-1, is it 16-1? Ultimately, I believe that silver is another commodity whose value will find itself monetized in gold. It will be X amount of silver at some point as it floats on the market will find itself valued in a certain amount of gold, with gold being the standard value. I don't think silver will ever replace gold in that role. So that means ultimately gold is the standard of value, and silver can fluctuate as much as it wants to, and as much as the markets and regions and people groups determine it to be, but ultimately gold is the value. And then again, when you look at gold competing on the world stage with the dollar, because that's what I truly think it comes down to now, is you can only have one. A lot of people believe that gold is truly the value, and that's why you see its value going up in dollars, because dollars are running to it. And the dollar is deteriorating, it's being inflated away, it's being destroyed and eroded. But this was just an eye-opening experience for me to see the words of Marx as he views metals as money. Interesting points, interesting reading. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a lot, an hour and 5 minutes. I doubt many of you sat through it. I'm sure maybe one of you did. I'm guessing that a handful of you are remaining here now. You might have to watch this in 2 or 3 different phases, 20 minutes at a pop. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being part of the Junius Maltby channel, and for taking this time to see how communists and the founders of communism viewed gold.